Can politicians be ousted if they didn't sign their oath of office? How should the American left respond to the crisis men are facing? Is the inability to freeze a baby for 27 years definitive proof that an embryo is not a human life? We tackle these takes and more on this episode of Good Take, Bad Take. Hey friends, welcome to this episode of Good Take, Bad Take. This is the show where we scour the internet for the takes of the century. We collect them and try to highlight what's good about some of the good takes we find and highlight what's bad about some of the bad ones that aren't so great. My name is Donald and I'm here with my co-host Britt. And before we get started, just a reminder to like and share and follow us on socials. All that good stuff helps us out a ton. You can follow us at Good Take, Bad Take Pod on Instagram and Good Bad Take Pod on Twitter and YouTube. Without further ado, let's get into the takes for today. So the first is a conversation that Kurt Schlichter is having with some people. He really gets into conversations on Twitter that are pretty amusing a lot of the time. And for a little bit of context before I read this out, he's been a very vocal backer of Ron DeSantis. He was a very big Trump supporter in 2020, but he thinks now DeSantis has the best shot at beating Biden. That's kind of his perspective here. He was criticizing Liz Cheney on something, and someone dredged up an old tweet of his from 2013. This person replying to him saying, "This you," and the original Kurt Schlichter tweet from 2013 reads, "Liz Cheney is a Republican for the future. Enzi, with his corporatist internet sales tax, is one for the past. Hashtag Cheney14 at Hugh Hewitt." So this person is obviously highlighting that he was a big proponent of Liz Cheney, and now he seems to have changed his tune, obviously. And Kurt Schlichter quote retweets this saying, "Yes, from almost exactly 10 years ago when she was running as an actual conservative against a soft Republican incumbent. He was garbage, and she turned into garbage years later. So yes, I preferred her before she turned to crap." And then someone replies to that saying, "But trust you on DeSantis?" And Kurt Schlichter replies to this, which is the take we will be critiquing, which says, "No, no, 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 no. Don't trust me on anything. Don't trust any pundit. Read what I think and evaluate it yourself. Maybe you think I'm right, maybe you think I'm wrong, but don't rely on me. You're an American. You make your decisions." What do you think about this take, Britt?
I think it's good. It seems a little tricksy, I guess, in terms of him like deflecting, because what the Racer Hex, the Twitter user, criticizing him is like, well, you weren't able to predict what happened with Liz Cheney properly, and you weren't able to, figure that out. So why should we trust you on DeSantis? And he doesn't really make any case for why his judgment is good or why he deserves to be a pundit. But that aside, I mean, his advice is correct. Like, we can't trust the pundits, we can't trust the news, we can't trust the journalists anymore. If anything, at best, right now, they're currently just the ability to give us information, and we need to evaluate that against sources that we can look up and our own don't believe your own lying eyes, to steal the phrase. So we need to be able to do that. So I like that what's he's saying. I do get a little tired though of like these Republicans, and I don't really know what Kurt Schlichter thought of like George W. Bush, but you would think after a couple times of like, oh yeah, this Republican talked a really good game and all this stuff, and then once they were in there, they turned bad. You would start to rethink some of your positions on stuff. So it's almost like he's criticizing himself in a way. I don't know. What do you think?
I think you've had the exact take that I did, which is in a vacuum, this take about don't trust pundits, make the evaluation yourself. I think that's absolutely correct, and that is what you need to do. A lot of America, and to me, that's kind of like the first step, right? A lot of people who consume news, even if you're not that politically interested, or even more so if you are, they don't get to that first step, and that should be the first starting point, is that you don't just follow what someone says because you are their follower. It's like, I disagreed with Dave Smith on like abortion when he was pro-abortion. He ended up coming around to my position on that, which is great. But it's like, I loved all of his stuff, but that didn't mean, well, maybe I should reevaluate my position on it. No, I heard his arguments. I didn't agree with them. And eventually my perspective went out there. But just because, someone you like or someone who agrees with you in a lot of the cases is saying something or is an authority or whatever sort of fallacious reasoning there is to trust them at all points, you shouldn't just buy their word, right? You should hear what they say, evaluate the arguments, and make that call. But to your other point, which I think is the real thing, is you can make all of the arguments that you want. You can take his reasoning, and that's fine. And you can evaluate that. But you have to admit that when it comes to evaluating the character of a person, in particular, a politician who is selling themselves as I am going to do X and Y, when that is unreliable, then it doesn't really matter who the messenger is. You know, it doesn't matter if Kurt Schlichter is very trustworthy, whether he has value or not. I think the reality is that politicians are by their nature slimy. By their nature, they have incentive to change, to say one thing and do another. And this is demonstrated by how all politicians act. I mean, even in some of the most insulated positions ever, like the Supreme Court, you know, people talk about conservative or liberal justices, but when you look at the voting habits of justices, they over time, the longer they're in there, they always lean more left. That's always what's
Mm.
going to happen, pretty much. So you can never guarantee the trajectory of an individual, how they're going to act, how they're going to uh, govern. And so, in light of that, I think that the thing that you know, and Kurt Schlichter's pretty red pilled. You know, as far as conservatives go, I like him just because he is kind of like a he's not wishy washy, which I appreciate. But it does lead to that position where it's like just get the right guy in there, just beat Biden, just you know, just get the people in there who have the guts to do it. And you know, I think that when you see that it doesn't matter how good someone is at the start, they're never going to end up where you need them, then you actually need to change the system itself, right? Maybe it's not that you just got to get the right person in there who's going to tear down the walls. It's you need to actually tear down the walls, and you need to institutionally destroy some of these trappings that are going to cause the incentives to be corrupt, aka power.
Yeah. Yep. Yeah, and it's almost like like, oh, track record doesn't matter. It's like, well, it does. Like that's what's being called into question here. And I think like you were saying, there's a huge lesson to be learned. It's that anyone that does get the reins of power inevitably starts to drift towards garbage, as he would put it. I happen to think that Liz Cheney was probably always garbage.
Yeah.
Um, but I mean, maybe she was good on. I don't even remember this whole internet sales tax thing. Um, I obviously you know in Washington State and other places, is that where they were like mandating that the state that you're shipping to now has to
I,
charge sales tax?
I think so. Yeah, I believe so.
Okay. That's amazing. It's surprising to me that she opposed that. Or maybe she didn't. I don't know. It seems like from this thread that she did, but
Yeah, well, I was gonna say it's also possible that she didn't support it and he did. And so when you're in that situation, you know, I will say this is maybe to the credit of Schlichter, in opposition with the critics that are coming at him. I think a lot of his critics are sort of trying to come at him from the right. You know, there are all kinds of loony people saying things like, "Oh, you still have your Hillary 2016 bumper sticker on." It's like, okay, like I might disagree with Schlichter here, but that's just a really stupid
yeah,
critique. And so I think that this, even though he's saying I'm supporting Liz Cheney, the reason why he outlines in the tweet, which is NZ is a corporatist for internet sales tax. So it's like, even though I agree with you, I think Liz Cheney probably always has been garbage. His reasoning here at least is consistent with what he would claim his ideology and reasoning is now. So sure, he can't have predicted the way that Liz Cheney would go necessarily.
that's
Maybe
yeah,
that's the kind of insight that you would want. But as far as a policy perspective, he's been consistent. He's not
yeah.
like supported her because she was a neocon and a lefty as far as the Republican Party is concerned. He wasn't supporting her when those things were. He was supporting her because she was in opposition to someone who was going to be corporatist.
Yeah,
So
the worst you could take away from it is he just keeps getting fooled.
yeah,
Is yeah,
exactly. So like you said, it doesn't really vindicate him on sort of the but trust you on DeSantis bit. However, it does on some of the other critiques he's getting. So yeah, it is kind of a mixed take. I think I agree with you there, but yeah, it he's right. Don't trust pundits. Evaluate things for yourself, but also recognize that you know trying to predict the actions of someone is always a tricky game, and maybe politicians aren't who they say they are, which is a
yeah.
shocking thought, that too many people somehow think that their politician is the exception to that rule. Okay, this is a comment from a Facebook post regarding um, local Washington state politics. But it was just kind of funny because I thought to me, it displays a particular characteristic that we'll talk about. So this comment reads: check to see if there was an oath of office signed by Governor Inslee and the Attorney General and most of Congress. Finding out that a lot of them didn't sign it, so they can violate their oath of office freely. They can be removed because they can govern without it, and anything they have done without it can be undone. What do you think about this take, Britt?
If only that was true.
The naivete.
I know, I know. It's I got a bridge to sell this person. I mean, this is a bad take. This is a bad take coming from a person that has good intentions, and
Yes.
and they labor under delusion that the America and government system that we are pitched, the one of checks and balances and public servants, emphasis on the servant part, and everyone has best interest in mind of everyone else, and someone's word is their bond. That exists in politics, and it definitely does not. Um, e- Even if this is true, I have no idea if it is or not. Even if it's true, like what makes you think that this is going? You have to get everyone on board with you to do this, and it would be easier to get everyone on board to just convince them that these people are awful people, first of all, and they shouldn't be in power. You don't need some weird gotcha. It kind of reminds me of like the January 6th protesters. It's like government is no longer, if you control some part of the hill, and now you're in power. It used to be because if you controlled that seat of power, all the populace believe that whoever sits on that throne is the one that controls and who are going to obey. But that's no longer the case. With the age of the internet and the way communication, how fast it is, and all that stuff. Just because you occupy a building doesn't mean you rule a country. If that was the case, then the QAnon shaman guy would have been president a long time ago when they stormed the Capitol and occupied the congressional chamber. So yeah, it's just this is like looking for like a weird little like is this like a libertarian person or
No, no.
okay.
This was on the Republican Party page of some kind. So
Oh, bummer. Okay, because I was gonna say this has a little bit of like the new libertarian and a little bit autistic side of like I got you on this little thing, but
yeah,
yeah, it's just like yeah, you found a little loophole, but if it was that easy, it would have been done already, and it's not. That's not the case.
yeah, yeah. I was gonna say, this. Oh man, this feels like one of those Facebook posts that you'd read where it's like, I do not consent to let
Yes.
Facebook access my data. And like you said, it's like it's coming from the right place at least. Like they don't have ill intentions, but it is something that you kind of have to overcome, which is the idea that somehow we are able to hold this absolute position of authority accountable, um, to itself. It's funny because the two offices they list are the governor and the attorney general, which are probably the two single most important positions that would hold any other elected officials accountable. It's like the attorney general is the one who's supposed to enforce the law on behalf of Washington state. And the governor, of course, is the executive who's supposed to make sure that the law is enforced. So it's just funny that you're saying, like, oh, yeah, no, I'm sure that the two most likely people to enforce the law will hold themselves to their own standards. I mean, there has to be political will, first and foremost. And there are much more blatant violations of people who took oaths that are on record and openly defying those oaths and lying before Congress, like James Clapper, or even all of the stuff with the Biden corruption going on right now. Is just if there was political will, there would be some kind of reckoning here, but there's clearly not. And so, just from the perspective of, you know, it's just not feasible that this would happen, even if that was something that people would be tried on. I don't really think that. I think even if there was some kind of an investigation that was done and they found out that in fact Inslee never signed his oath of office, which I just have no belief that he didn't. Like, even if this was some sort of sacred oath, it's not like a politician cares about that kind of thing, right? They lie through their teeth all the time. What is signing an oath to them? There's nothing
Yeah.
sacred in this life except power. And so, but let's say, for the sake of argument, that he did not, and there was this third party entity that was investigating this. Do we honestly expect that anything would come of it? He'd probably say, "Oh, sorry, I'll sign that," and then that would be that. So I think that the key takeaway here is we need to move the popular perception, not to say that America is a terrible place and that America is totally corrupt and has no value. Like that's not the message I'm trying to preach here. What I think we do need to recognize though is the foundation of ideals of America were good, but in practice, a government always is going to corrupt those things, and the system we live in right now is not the one that we are taught it is. Because if you're operating under that assumption, that's how they play the game. When you can when you can shatter that narrative and change the paradigm on them faster than they can react, that's when they have to retreat and be put on the back heels. That's what you saw, I think, in some part with Trump, not because he himself was great, but because it was this massive backlash to the conventional standards. And I think also you see it with a lot of like social media and like individual citizen journalism and things like the Project Veritas, although now it's the James O'Keefe group or whatever. Those things where you can get ahead, you can realize that the narrative that they're pitching you is not right, and you can go behind the scenes, you can see past that, you can take the red pill, open your eyes to the matrix and understand what's going on. That's how we can more effectively get to the ends that people like this want to achieve. The problem is when you buy into this system, even with good intentions, like to say we should hold them accountable, you're playing into their hand, unfortunately.
Yeah, I agree with you there.
Okay, we'll move on to our next take. This comes from Senator Chris Murphy of Connecticut. Now, Chris Murphy is a liberal who I follow him because he's pretty good on anti-war stuff most of the time. I don't know that he's been very good on Ukraine, but pre-Ukraine, he was very good on joining a lot of non-interventionist legislation with like Rand Paul and Bernie Sanders when Bernie Sanders was in the mood to be anti-war. Um, Chris Murphy's also, very anti-gun, very outspoken on that. So he's not like he's not libertarian by any means. He's just very lefty. And so I thought this was an interesting take from him. So and for the record, I have not read the book that he is referencing, nor have I read his book that he cites as well. But I still wanted to read his thoughts here. Chris Murphy tweets, "Finished Of Boys and Men by Richard Reeves. Just excellent and so necessary. Covers some of the themes I wrote about in my book. The bottom line, the left is missing the crisis happening with men today, and we need to talk about it openly and without fear. We cannot avoid the biological/evolutionary differences between men and women. It's not, quote, toxic masculinity that causes men to commit 90% of murders, for instance. Both biology and thousands of years of culture have wired men differently. Policy has to acknowledge that. Both Reeves and I write about the identity crisis happening with men as, in one short generation, they lost their roles as primary family earners. The right is wrong to just say we should go back to the 1950s, but the left is wrong to just tell men to get over it. Reeves is smart to suggest policies shaped towards men's needs. More hands on instruction for boys who learn differently, more rights and expectations for non married fathers, more paths and less shaming of men who go into teaching, healthcare, and social work. But the bottom line for progressives is that our reaction to the Hawley book, Josh Hawley also wrote a book on this, can't be to think men and masculinity is just something the right talks about. There is something profound happening with American men, and the left should address it with more responsible solutions. What do you think about that, Britt?
This is a really good and interesting take. It's like I almost feel like I hopped in a time machine, to see a liberal left Democrat, acknowledging there is a difference between men and women. It's
Yeah.
almost like once you acknowledge there are distinctions, that you can actually have an interesting and forward moving conversation about the problem. And he does a really good job in this, like laying out how like that, like, just like I was saying, it's necessary to acknowledge there are differences in order for us to find a solution. I don't necessarily agree, particularly with some of his probably with some of his policies, prescriptions to how to fix some of these sorts of things. But his diagnosis of the issue is, I think, right on. In that we, like you're saying, for thousands of years, there were really well defined roles between men and women. And yes, there were some exceptions, like really, really rare exceptions, but like everything about how men interacted and when women interacted was because of those roles. Like it was biological function. Women in general did not have the muscle mass or the strength necessary to go out and hunt, but men did. And because if men were going to go expend their energy doing that, which was necessary to feed the family, that meant women had to do other types of, stuff. It's not that men oppressed women or women were oppressing men. It's that men and women work together. A lot, there's kind of this view within, and we kind of hear about it in our education system, even me being homeschooled. I heard about this all the time when we were learning about women's suffrage in the early 1900s. And it's just this weird view that, mankind's history is men oppressing women. And I just don't think that's true. I mean, if you look at all of the wars that have been fought, the vast majority, like 99.9% of people that die in those violent conflicts are men. The majority of violent deaths in general are done by men. All of the hardest working positions that carry the most amount of casualty and injury and suffering and long hours have been bore by men. And it's not because men, want to or like have to do that. It's because, I mean, yeah, it's because they have to do it. It's because it's a biological necessity. We are the only ones in terms of our biological structure that can actually bear that burden. And because we are bearing that half of the equation, there's another half of it, child rearing, homemaking, those sorts of things that have unfortunately been, casted as like humiliating or second rate or something like that, which is very interesting. My wife's pregnant right now, and it's just one of the most amazing things for me to watch her grow this little human being in her belly on like basically automated, right? Like her body just knows what to do when she's got this kid in her. And I can't do that, right? Like that's not something I can do. It is, and she's told me, she's like, yeah, like I feel so honored that I get to do this, and I almost feel sad that you don't get to experience, because she gets to feel every little movement of my little daughter in her, and she gets to see her kick and gets to experience her grow and change and all these different things. And it's like, yeah, the arc of history is not men oppressing women; it's that men and women have been a team. And Chris is doing a really great job laying out that, like, yeah, when there's a huge change to the role of one of the teammates, like if we don't address that, if we don't think about the implications of that, we're going to have issues, which we're having right now.
Yeah, I agree with everything you're saying here. I mean, for one, it is startling to see that someone would come out, someone who is a lefty. They're not, again, not moderate. It's not like this is Joe Manchin or in West Virginia or anything. Like this is Connecticut. This is a lefty guy on the forefront of this kind of stuff. And so this kind of realism is really nice to see. It really is. Um I I also think it's interesting that he acknowledges things that, for instance, there need to be specific policies and changes addressed to men because of this biological reality. And I think that is something that, even apart from the sort of the broader trans dialogue, that's something that's been not acknowledged because of the emphasis on feminism and what was seen as women being oppressed. And so you now look at how universities and schooling in the public sector has been formed and shaped, and a lot of that is to specifically how women tend to learn and
Yes.
benefit. And that's not to say not every guy is that way. Like, certain aspects of the way that these schools and learning and things operate, guys can get along with, but that's not by nature how many guys are. And so therefore you see higher success rates of women on average than men. And again, that's not to say it's a bad thing, but the problem is it's coming at the cost of men's opportunities and learning and things like that. And so when you think about all of that in together, then we do need to acknowledge that there are fundamental actions and differences that need to be specifically addressed to men. And when you don't acknowledge that because you're worried about either the lashback from the trans community, or when you're worried about just the last track from general feminism, then you are going to leave men behind and in the dust. And like you said, maybe not all of the solutions we're going to agree upon, but we do have to recognize that because this is a fundamental distinctive reality, and there's a fundamental distinctive differences between the two, there have to be fundamental distinct actions that have to be taken to address that, rather than just sort of hodgepodging it all and say, no, it's just this nebulous idea of toxic masculinity, and that's the only thing we need to change. That's not going to address anything, when especially when you're not talking about what productive masculinity is to men, when you're telling that there's such a thing as non-toxic masculinity, but also women can be men, and also a man can't go and be great in achievement because that would be him, mansplaining to a woman, or whatever the limitations you impose on men are. I think the problem is so many men have just been limited and told that the way that they're choosing to express themselves and uh, be addressed is either not distinct or unique, and they need to not act in ways that are different than women, or they're told that the ways that they are acting different is specifically oppressive to women or
Yeah.
men. And so I think the fundamental acknowledgement of reality is a really good step into actual productive conversations about that. And so the last thing I think I would mention that I haven't talked about is when he says, like, the right is wrong to say we should just go back to the 1950s, but the left is wrong to tell men to just get over it. I actually think he's right there. Not because I don't think there are valuable structures from the 1950s. I actually think there are things that we should probably take into account from the 50s. However, we should also recognize that you actually can't go back to the 50s. The
Yeah.
world we live in is fundamentally different than how it was back then. And whether for good or ill, it's not something we can just ignore and pretend and go back to. And I think about just the very fact that we're living in an age where housing affordability is such a major crisis that the average, couple that wants a single income can't afford a house. That fundamentally alone changes the reality from the 1950s, the era that our grandparents grew up in, or even the reality that our parents grew up in. These kinds of things have to change, and that's not a consequence of it being better or worse for rights. It's just a fundamental reality. And so I do think that this plays into how men's roles have changed and how they need to be addressed. And I think that from the right, when they just say you just have to do it like we did yesterday, that also is an inadequate solution. Even if you're acknowledging there's a difference between men and women, if you're not acknowledging there's a difference between 2023 and 1970 or 1950, then I think you're also missing the point and what men need.
Yeah, and that this conservative longing to go back to the 1950s and such, there are elements of toxic masculinity, like actual toxic masculinity, of devaluing women, of talking down to them, of being abusive and domestic violence and all sorts of things like that. And those are not things like the problem that we encounter though is that when the left and people label all masculinity as lumping in with that. So like they lump in things like wanting to work out, wanting to improve yourself, wanting to be financially stable, wanting to be a good leader, to uphold honor, being committed to family values, praising things like modesty within women and men. Things they lump those sorts of things in with the abuse that occurred, before all of this stuff was going on. And so what happens is young men are not able to understand the difference anymore. They just hear you're bad because you're a man, and being a man is all of these things. And so suddenly, virtues are also now being confused with vices in young men. And we talked about this, I think, on the last episode. But that's where you have people and characters like Andrew Tate, who are able to take advantage of that, right? So they're able to both appeal to what is the deepest longing of a man's heart, while also appealing to their worst and most evil desires, and saying they're okay and enabling them in that. And so, if we really truly want to do away with actual toxic masculinity, we want people to actually live up to what their design is. But in order for us to live up to that, we have to know that there is a design in the first place, that men are supposed to be men and women are women, and there's a distinct difference between the two of them.
I think that's absolutely right. Okay, our next tweet comes from John Cooper, who writes, "Understand now, MAGA," with the following meme. with a picture of a baby who says, "This is baby Molly. She was born from an embryo that had been frozen for 27 years. If we put baby Molly in a freezer for 27 years, baby Molly would die. Why can you freeze an embryo but not a baby? Because an embryo isn't a living human." What do you think about this? As your wife is pregnant, you've been walking through this journey. Is this a compelling argument to you?
No, it's not. I like to be unfair to him. I would say, hey, you come on the jujitsu mat with me. Why can't I choke out Hunter and he doesn't die? But if I grab onto you, you're gonna die. It's like that must mean you're not a human. It's just like it's such an unfair and sleazy way to make an argument. Of course, humans are going to have different levels of survivability at every stage of their life, right? The more you have in order to address this question and to address this argument, you'd have to make a point that like, oh, this embryo is not a separate thing of DNA, right? Like that this embryo has separate DNA, it's distinct, it's on its own, and it has its own potentiality that is left to do its natural process is going to become something. And what is that something? Well, it's going to become a human being. Okay, so then that DNA that is separate and distinct is that of a human being. So, and it's living, right? By all definitions, we found that on Mars. To borrow the meme that they don't like if we found that on Mars, we'd say that that is living. And if it's living and it's got distinctive DNA and it's human and it eventually will become a human being, then it is a human being.
Yes. Yeah, I feel like this is just a dumb argument because um it reduces the definition of what a baby human is to one distinctive factor when that's just clearly not the case. It's
Yeah.
like, it's like, if you look at a baby who is prematurely born, for instance, but we would all recognize is still a baby, but needs to be hooked up to a machine to help breathe, right? It's like this baby needs a machine to help breathe. But if we, took her off, then she would die. Is she no longer a baby? And it's like, well, it probably depends on the answer depends to these people on how prematurely early she's born. To any normal rational human, no, that doesn't change her personhood just because she needs a machine to help breathe. Just in the same way that like we don't think it's weird that a baby needs to like breastfeed from its mom, but a 5-year-old doesn't because they can eat other kinds of food. There's all kinds of differential factors when it comes to what developmental stage a child is in and what their bodies do and don't react to. Just the very fact that like bone density and is different in babies and like they're way easier to harm and hurt because they are more fragile doesn't mean that they're less human than when their bones are denser and they can get knocked in a couple times on the football field and be fine. There's so many different kinds of factors that go into the life, um but if you're talking about defining life, I should say, but if you're talking about this as the only one, it's just a completely arbitrary definition that we would never use in any other context to define if something's alive. Is it living or is it dead? Can you freeze it for 27 years? That's not a definition that anyone would accept in any other context. So that's
Yeah.
not a good definition for your single definitional debate here.
Yeah, yeah, that's really funny. I saw I can't remember where I saw this. It was on I think it was on my Instagram feed, but it was basically someone talking about just and extolling the just how amazing human life is when it's born, and specifically that human babies and humans in general carry their babies for longer than any other species, right? Both in the womb as well as once they're born. They're not able to like walk or do anything. Whereas if a little baby deer is born, they're generally able to walk and do things right from the get go. And it's because human babies and humans will just they have so much brain development that needs to occur, right? So a baby's helplessness at every stage of its development is actually intrinsic to what makes it human, right? It's the fact that resources are being taken to feed the brain, to make it develop in certain ways that eventually will turn into, a full grown adult because we have learned that we can protect human babies all the way up until they're, somewhat self sufficient. And so anyone that's advocating for this stuff, and you see it in the comments, like if you go find this tweet by John Cooper, if you go look in the comments, people will say things like, yeah, but like the inevitable conclusion of this, right, is that if a baby can't take care of itself at 1 years old, then should that be able to be killed? And there are people that seriously answer that, yeah, like I think up until about 2 or 3, a parent can decide whether their kid should still be around or not. So that's exactly what's going to occur, you know, when you decide that human lives and human babies are there. There's qualifiers like this that make absolutely no sense.
Exactly right. Yeah. Okay, we'll move to our last take here. This one comes from Joshua Reed Eagle, classic liberal caucus guy in the Libertarian Party. He tweets, "Next time you see a landlord, thank them for the valuable service they provide to the market." And it shows the meme of the soldier standing over the sleeping child, and the soldier is labeled landlords, and the child is renters, and then the daggers and grenades and fire bombs and bullets behind him are listed property tax, repairs, insurance, down payment. What are your thoughts?
This is a great take.
Yeah.
I mean, I think we've had maybe equal amounts of good takes and bad takes from Joshua Reed Eagle on here.
Yeah.
And of course, this is the whole aspect and the economy of landlords and renters, right? Like, there's a certain amount of economic output that is required to own a house. That might include the resources to build it. It might include the resources to compensate the people who did build it. And then, unfortunately, and it also requires you to pay the property tax, making sure that the building is kept up to date and is not doesn't have any potential deal breaking issues with it, insurance, all that good stuff. Those are things that renters don't have to deal with. And one of my best friends out from Spokane, he's a bit older than you and I. I think he's in his late 50s now and retired. But he had a really really nice large house for a while, and then he got tired of all the maintenance on it. So part of his retirement was like, well, we're just going to sell our house and we're going to go rent a house. And I was asking, I was like, hey, why did you do that? And he's like, it's awesome. If something breaks, and my wife notices if the sink is leaking or something like that, I just call the landlord and they send someone over to fix it, and it's taken care of right away, and it's no stress on me. Right. So there are functions that are being served. I think that liberals and people who really hate, landlords and stuff, and hate on them, on Reddit and things like that, like they are correct in realizing there is some level of distortion within the market, right? And one of the biggest controls of the landlord to renters being able to actually own a place is the insurance, not the insurance, the interest rates for borrowing money and things like that. Those just totally distort the market and actually contribute to this inequality. Whereas if we had an open and fair market, a lot of these disproportionate things that were occurring would be a lot less so, and it would be easier for renters that were responsible to get into a house.
Yeah, I think that's right. I've been working a little bit on some of our Washington state housing, recommendations for affordable housing, and there are some pretty crazy stats when it comes to the way that permitting and regulations also add to costs of home construction. There are some studies that show that I'm trying to remember the I think so it's the I think it might be all regulations, including national, maybe not just Washington state, but are sort of add up to about $144,000 of cost on a median home in Washington state. So before any piece of material is laid, before any labor has been given, $144,000 of that house's cost is attributed just to the permitting and zoning and regulations that people have to get through. In Washington state, there aren't there you have to submit for certain permitting sequentially. So like you have to submit a permit, pay the fee. It has like who knows how many days in review. Then once that's approved, then you can submit the next one. However many days later, then you can't even submit them all simultaneously, and this is for small projects as well as large. There's no automatic renewal. So there's so many ways in which you could actually um create affordable housing in so many ways, but the problem is all of these things contribute to people not wanting to be landlords, because now not only do you have all of this initial cost that makes buying the housing market things, like an apartment building and constructing these things super prohibitive, But then you, on top of that, you have all the regulations that hurt landlords. So things like, for instance, letting renters not have their backgrounds checked when you're renting. That's a huge liability for landlords. And then when you're giving more and more liability to landlords, so you're talking about, you list things like property tax, repairs, insurance, and down payments, all that on landlords currently. And then you're not even talking about things like instituting rent control or adding ways in which tenants can sue their landlords for things that are beyond their wheelhouse. There's so many just different situations that end up adding to costs so that landlords don't want to exist. And then what happens when you don't have landlords is you don't have places to live that are kept up and maintained well. And so then rents go up. And so then housing prices go up. So not only are landlords providing these services actively, but just by the very basis of there being people willing to either invest in new construction or build new construction themselves, adds to the supply, adds to the competition, and lowers prices for everyone. So literally, a landlord can be a kind of bad landlord, but the very fact that he owns and exists and creates more than one option, that in and of itself creates a better market economy, because it creates competition and more supply in the short term.
Yeah, and landlords also contribute a really important factor to just property existence, which is ownership. When you get like public housing and things like that, where no one truly owns it. I mean, they say the public owns it or the government owns it. In reality, no one owns it because no one has a vested interest in making sure it continues and is in good state of repair and all sorts of things like that. But landlords own houses. They make sure they want to, in order for their investment to continue to pay dividends to them, they want to make sure that tenants are at a reasonable level of happiness in order to stay, and that they can attract good tenants, as well as that the property stays in good enough state that if they did have a tenant leave, that they could get another tenant in there, as well as if they needed to eventually sell that property, they could. And you think about in Seattle, we have an organization called Downtown Emergency Service Center, DESC, and they built and bought various buildings in Seattle. They had one called the Morrison Hotel. I believe it was like $250 million was invested into remodeling this, and it was mainly for people who were homeless and drug addicts and things like that. And when I was working at a commercial contractor in the HVAC market, we were looking at doing the maintenance on this building, right? So they had big commercial HVAC units supplying it for, I think it was like 1,000 units in that building. And they could not get a single contractor to agree to come do the maintenance in there because you'd have to go through the building to get to the roof to work on the units. And to go through the building was to literally trudge through human feces, potentially step on used drug needles, as well as, at threat of violence, within the elevators and stuff like that from people that were in there. And anytime one of our technicians went on site, we had to give them the rest of the day off so they could go home and clean up because they were just so dirty from visiting that place. And that hotel that had a $250 million remodel into it had only been operating for about 9 months, right? And because there was no vested ownership in it, there was no one that was actually, the people that were actually living there were not being held accountable by the people who quote unquote owned it. It meant that it quickly went into a state of disarray. And it was just awful, right? Like you ruin this fantastic asset that people who probably are willing to pay money for are not going to be able to use it for, but it's all ruined because there is no interest or ownership in it. So landlords also provide that. And again, like I was saying earlier, like the dynamic between landlords and renters is skewed. It is not good. It is very hard to become a homeowner in Washington State, but it is not because of of landlords. It is because of the Federal Reserve and the interest rates. They've made it so hard to actually make enough money to outsave the inflation. In Washington State, we've got, I think it's like 15% average growth in home prices year over year. So that means that unless you're able to save 15 to 20% of your income, you're not going to be able to outpace the rate at which housing appreciates year over year. That you just have to save 15% just to make sure that you're gaining just a little bit to be able to afford a house or anything like that. So that is primarily driven by the Federal Reserve, and we've done lots of other podcasts and stuff on that, and you can look those up. But the person to blame, the entity to blame for this awful housing situation is not the landlords, it's the government, as are most things.
Yeah. Couldn't put it better myself. All right. Well, thank you guys so much for tuning into this episode. We really appreciate it. Make sure to like and share and subscribe with your friends. Helps us out a ton. We'll catch you on the next one. Take care.